Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at 2 Kings chapters 9 and 10, where we read about the rise of Jehu. 2 Kings chapter 9 and verse 1, Now Elisha the prophet called one of the sons of the prophets and said to him, Gird up your loins and take this flask of oil in your hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. Ramoth Gilead, it's one of those cities on the east side of the Jordan. Whenever you hear that word Gilead, you know that's east of the Jordan River. And it was a border town between Aram and Israel. Technically it was in Israel, but Aram has been contesting for it, and it's become a battleground. Verse 2, When you arrive there, search out Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, and go in and bid him arise from among his brothers and bring him to an inner room. Then take the flask of oil and pour it on his head and say, Thus says the Lord, I have anointed you king over Israel. An anointing is a promissory action. You take oil and pour it over that person, and it signifies that God's will, that you are being chosen by God to be an anointed one. The way you say anointed one in Hebrew is a Messiah, but that's not the Messiah. It's not Jesus. But he's going to be sort of a Messiah, I guess you could say, with a small m. And he's going to be anointed to be the new king over Israel. Now, there's already another king over Israel, but he's going to be replacing that king. Reminds us of how David was anointed by Samuel in order to replace Saul. And in this case, he's to anoint this man Jehu. And notice he's told, and then open the door and flee and do not wait, because the bad things are going to happen. You don't want to be around for the rest of it. So the young man, the servant of the prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead. He's obeying his orders. When he came, behold, the captains of the army were sitting, and he said, I have a word for you, O captain. And Jehu said, Well, which one of us? And he said, For you, O captain. He arose and went into the house, and he poured the oil on his head and said to him, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I have anointed you king over the people of the Lord, even over Israel. You shall strike the house of Ahab your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. This is going to be 2 chapters of vengeance, and it's not Jehu taking vengeance, it's God taking vengeance, but he's using Jehu as his strong right arm, as his sword, as his knife to bring about this vengeance. Verse 8, For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab. Now, Ahab's already dead, but he's talking about his descendants. And I will cut off from Ahab every male person, both bond and free in Israel. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Jeroboam had been the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, but that line had all been cast aside because of their sin. And not only the house of Jeroboam, that had been the first dynasty, and also like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahaziah, this was the second dynasty that had come along, and they were all gone. Verse 10, the dogs shall eat Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, and none shall bury her. Then he opened the door and fled. And so he gives this word of judgment, and true to the orders that he's been given, as soon as he gives the word, he now leaves. Verse 11, Now Jehu came out to the servants of his master, and one said to him, Is all well? Why did this mad fellow come to you? And he said to them, You know very well the man and his talk. And they said, What's a lie? Tell us now. And so, there's this interesting dialogue taking place. And Jehu, you almost get a sense where he doesn't want to come right out and say it. He wants them to say it. But he said, Thus and thus, he said to me, and that's just a Hebrew way of saying, in other words, he told the story. I'm not going to retell the whole thing. Thus says the Lord, I have anointed you king over Israel. And that's the sort of the finale. Verse 13, Then they hurried, and each man took his garment and placed it under him on the bare steps, and blew the trumpet, saying, Jehu is king. But there's still another king that has to be displaced, but they are recognizing the kingship of Jehu. Now, notice the sort of the family outline. I want to get a sense of what's going on. We have Sidon, that's the Phoenician king on the left, and then Ethbaal, the king of Sidon, had entered into a marital alliance with Omri, and they'd done that by Jezebel marrying Ahab, and now they've had a number of sons, and Ahab has already died, and Ahaziah over on the left has died, and leaving his brother Joram as the king of Israel. And he's the one that's going to be displaced now. Meanwhile, there's a marital alliance, another marital alliance that's taken place when the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, Athaliah, has married Jehoram. And so there's a Phoenician queen, or at least the daughter of a Phoenician queen, who's now queen over Judah. And that's going to lead to some nasty occurrences. Verse 14. So Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, he's king of, or he's a newly pronounced king. He's not king yet, but he's been pronounced king. So Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. Now Joram, with all Israel, was defending Ramoth Gilead against Hazael, king of Aram. We saw Hazael, king of Aram, in the last chapter. But King Joram had returned to Jezreel to be healed of the wounds which the Arameans had inflicted on him when he fought with Hazael, king of Aram. So there's a convalescence going on, and Joram is not at the battlefield. Instead, he's gone back to his winter home in Jezreel. So Jehu said, "If this is your mind, let no one escape or leave the city to go tell it in Jezreel. We need a closing of all the communications so word doesn't get back. We don't need a civil war. We need for that previous king to die, and I'm going to handle that." Verse 16, then Jehu rode in a chariot and went to Jezreel, for Joram was lying there. And meanwhile, Ahaziah, king of Judah, has come down to see Joram. Now remember, Ahaziah, he's king of Judah, but he's also the nephew of Joram. So he's coming to see his uncle Joram. How are you doing? How are you convalescing? Verse 17, now the watchman was standing on the tower in Jezreel, and he saw the company of Jehu as he came, and said, I see a company. And Joram said, take a horseman and send him to meet them, and let him say, is it peace? Is everything okay? I'm not really expecting a big company of people. Verse 18, so a horseman went to meet him and said, thus says the king, is it peace? And Jehu said, what have you to do with peace? Turn behind me. You don't want to get into this. Don't get between me and the king. Just, fall in behind. And the watchman reported, the messenger came to them, but he didn't come back. He's with them, but he's not returning. Then he sent out a second horseman who came to them and said, thus says the king, is at peace? And Jehu answered, same way. What have you to do with peace? Turn behind me. And again, that takes place. Meanwhile, we go back to the watchman, verse 20. The watchman reported he came even to them, and he did not return. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously. I'm not sure what furious driving looks like. I'm assuming he drove his chariot with something like a lead foot, stepping hard on the accelerator. And so he's coming in at quite a pace and quite a speed. Then Jehoram said, get ready, and they made his chariot ready. Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, they both go out, each in his chariot, and they went out to meet Jehu and found him. They found him in the property of Naboth, the Jezreelite. Now, you say, well, who's Naboth? Naboth was back in 1 Kings, toward the end of the book, where Ahab had coveted the property and field, the vineyard of Naboth, and his wife, Jezebel, had concocted the plan and carried it out, where Naboth was falsely accused and put to death so that Ahab could steal his property. And Ahab had gone along with it. And that sin is now going to come back. Well, it can't come back on Ahab, he's dead. But it's going to come back on the descendants of Ahab. When Joram saw Jehu, he said, is it peace, Jehu? And he answered, what peace, as long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many? And so now the challenge has been spoken. So Joram reigned about and fled and said to Ahaziah, there is treachery, O Ahaziah. And Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Joram between his arms, and the arrow went through his heart, and he sank in his chariot. And the king of Israel has just been killed. Then Jehu said to Bidkar, his officer, take him up and cast him into the property of the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. For I remember when you and I were writing together after Ahab his father, that the Lord laid this oracle against him. Sure, and here's the oracle. Surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his son, says the Lord, and I will repay you in this property, says the Lord. Now then, and now they're going to fulfill it. Now then, take and cast him into the property according to the word of the Lord. And so the death of Joram is going to answer for the injustice that Ahab and Jezebel had carried out against Naboth. Do you see how sometimes your children bear the effects of your sin? Sin has a way of passing on its consequences to other people and in families down to the next generation, sometimes a second and a third and even a fourth generation. When Ahaziah, the king of Judah, saw this, he was just a bystander. He fled by the way of the garden house, and Jehu pursued him and said, shoot him too in the chariot. So they shot him at the ascent of Gur, which is at Iblaim, but he fled to Megiddo and died there. So here on a map, notice this all started at Jezreel, and he flees down to Iblaim, but then after he's already been wounded, and he goes from there to Megiddo, and at Megiddo he dies. And remember, Megiddo is going to be a place where there is so much of this taking place. We've seen battles that were fought and victories that were either won or lost. And we're not seeing Megiddo, we're not done with seeing Megiddo as a place where God's judgment takes place. It's going to even become a byword where today sometimes, and this is taken from the book of Revelation, where we'll speak of the final Mount Megiddo. And the way you say that in Hebrew, Har is the word for mountain. Har Megiddo, or sometimes we say Armageddon. And that's pointing to Megiddo. And that's part of the imagery that is established here. And so we have Joram, who's been put to death, and he's the king of Israel. And then we had Ahaziah, king of Judah, put to death. And in the place of Joram, we're going to have a whole new dynasty, where Jehu's going to set up himself and his family. And in Judah, we're not going to have Jehu there. Instead, notice, if we've gotten, the kings have died, and Ahaziah has died, his father was already dead. And so that's going to leave Athaliah, the queen mother, who is, remember, she's the daughter of Jezebel. She's a Phoenician at heart, and she is a Phoenician when it comes to her religion. She's a worshiper of Baal. Verse 30, when Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, she's still alive, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she said, is it well? Notice how they've been asking that. Zimri, but then she knows what's happened. Your master's murderer. What's up with this? What's going on? Then he lifted up his face to the window and said, who is on my side? Who? Now notice, he hasn't said who's on God's side. Who's on my side? Jehu is obeying the command of God, but Jehu, let me just say, I think Jehu is also doing this for Jehu. So he says, who is on my side? Who? And 2 or 3 officials looked down at him, and he said, throw her down. And they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he trampled her underfoot. A very dispelling, a very shameful end to which she comes. When he came in, he ate and drank, and he said, see now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. They went to bury her, but they found nothing more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hand. The rest had been eaten by the wild dogs that hung about the palace. a very shameful and dishonorable end. Therefore they returned and told him, and he said, "This is the word of the Lord, which he had spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, the property of Jezreel, in the property of Jezreel, the dog shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel will be as," this is sort of nasty, "will be as dung on the face of the field." That sounds as bad as it sounds. As dung on the face of the field and the property of Jezreel, so they cannot say, "This is Jezebel." She has no honorable burial because she had been a very dishonorable woman. And the prophecy that we're referring to was given back in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 23. And so that's quoted here. And God's promise of judgment has come full circle to be fulfilled here in 2 Kings chapter 9. Now, Jehu from this point on moves to secure the throne. He sends a challenge to the 70 sons of Ahab in Samaria, those both sons and maybe other relatives, and they respond. They signify they're willing to recognize Jehu's leadership. Oh, yes, you'll be king. Of course, they're saying that. That's what you say when somebody else has the upper hand. But at first chance, they'll probably rebel. And so the elders of Samaria send Jehu the heads of the 70 sons. They are put to death, and the entire family of Ahab is wiped out. Verse 17, when he came to Samaria, he killed all who remained to Ahab in Samaria until he had destroyed him, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke to Elijah. Not to Elisha, back to Elijah. He's fulfilling the prophecy that had been given back there in 1 Kings. Next, he moves against those worshipers of Baal. He calls for a Baal festival. And here's the pronouncement. Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much. In other words, I'm going to be a big worshiper of Baal. Let's have a big festival on behalf of Baal. And he gathers all of the priests and the worshipers of Baal into a temple, and then he orders that everybody in the temple be killed. So Jehu's coming is a virtual bloodbath. Remember, he is the sharp sword that God is using to bring about God's judgment. And of course, Jehu is all too willing to do this. Jehu is doing the work of God, but I think Jehu is doing also the will of Jehu. He's doing it for, I think, his own purposes as well. And I think that's going to come out. And so the house of Baal is turned into a latrine. We're told that in verse 27. And we're going to see Baal worship removed completely from the land. Verse 28, thus Jehu eradicated Baal out of Israel, and that's good. However, verse 29, however, as for the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin, from these Jehu did not depart. And in case you're wondering what that is, we have a reminder here. Even the golden calves that were at Bethel and that were at Dan, back in the days of the Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, he had set up these two places of worship with golden calves there, a temple at Bethel, a temple at Dan, to replace the worship of God in the temple in Jerusalem, because they didn't want people going out of Jerusalem. And Jehu leaves that in place. So in verse 30, the Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in executing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. Not only will you be on the throne, but it's going to go down a number of generations, down to your great-grandchildren. But again, that doesn't change things. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel sin. So again, that's mentioned again. That hasn't gone away. That's still there, and that's still an ongoing problem. Because of that problem, we see some downfalls in Israel that's now under Jehu. We see that Hazael, remember the king of Aram, with his capital at Damascus, he defeated them throughout the territory of Israel, not just Jabesh Gilead, but it extends to all the lands on the east side of the Jordan, from the Jordan eastward. And so this all now falls, and suddenly Israel Israel becomes a lot smaller. Now the rest of the acts of Jehu and all that he did and all his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? And Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. And Jehoahaz, his son, became king in his place. Now the time which Jehu reigned over Israel and Samaria was 28 years, and thus our story about Jehu comes to an end. And yet we're going to see another reference much later on in our Old Testament. But before we do that, I want to show us where archaeology has actually referenced Jehu. The black obelisk, and you're seeing a picture of it, it is a black stela. It's written by Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria, and discovered by Austin Henry Layard in 1843. There's a little bit of damage, but it's mostly intact, and it lists the military campaigns and tributes that were paid during that period to the Assyrian king. It's an Assyrian stela, an Assyrian monument, and it includes one of the panels. Notice on this side you can see several panels. You can see the pictures from top to bottom, and then there will in the intervening sections, in what looks like the frames, there will be little notations of what that picture represents. And one of those panels has a picture of Jehu. Here's the panel of which we're speaking, and Jehu is the one in the middle. Notice he is on his hands and knees. He is bowing before Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king, and he is paying him tribute and offering his obedience. He's coming as a vassal, as basically a vassal king. We would say maybe a slave king. I mean, he's still king of Israel, but he is bowing down before this pagan king as he gives him his honor. And so we've seen the northern kingdom of Israel. Notice I've got the prophets on the left, Elijah and then Elisha. And then we had that third dynasty, which now comes to an end, and a new dynasty will begin with Jehu, who has put to death Joram, but who has also put to death Ahaziah. And so that dynasty came to an end too. And so we have Athaliah, that's not the wife of Ahaziah, rather that's the mother of Ahaziah, the queen mother, and she's going to be a very evil queen, and we'll see where that takes us, and we'll look at that next time. But first we want to look at the commentary of one of the prophets. And I'm speaking here of Hosea chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, where this is the story of Hosea, who takes his wife Gomer, and he's going to have children with her who will be prophetically significant. So he, that is Hosea, went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, name him, this son, Jezreel. For yet in a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel. Now, notice the bloodshed of Jezreel is what we've just been reading about. And I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, this takes place a number of generations later, so this isn't taking place immediately. By this time, Jehu has already died, and his son has died, and we've gone down a few generations. But on that day, he says in verse 5, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. That Jezreel, as it was the place where God's judgment came against the house of Ahab, again, God's judgment will come also eventually against the house of Jehu because of their sin, because of their lack of repentance. And what was done to the house of Ahab will also be done to the house of Jehu. You see, just because Jehu was used as the tool in the hand of God, as the sharp and cutting knife in the hand of God, doesn't mean that he can go and coast. He still needs to be faithful to the Lord. He still needs to worship the Lord in the right way and to not turn aside, to turn the hearts of his people back to the Lord. Leaders are responsible. And the book of James reminds us that leaders hold a special sort of liability. Being a Christian leader, does not make you is something special where you're not judged by God. Rather, it incurs a greater liability. James chapter 3 talks about how be not many teachers, because you will be judged that much more stringently.